Good afternoon all, and welcome to today's session on small second dwelling reforms being made to the planning and building systems. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands of which we are all tuning in from today. For me, I'm dialing in from Wurundjeri country, and I pay my respects to all elders past, present and emerging, and to all those other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who have tuned in with us today. For those who don't know me, I'm Andrew Greer. I'm the Executive Director of the Building Division and also the Planning and Building Reform areas, cladding, and also Bushfire and Emergency Recovery Coordination, and within the Department of Transport and Planning. It's my pleasure today to host the session and give you the opportunity to hear about these innovative reforms and what they mean for you as industry practitioners. We've been overwhelmed by interest in this session, and it's great to see so many people here today representing the building and plumbing industries. Many of you will now be familiar with the Victorian Government's housing statement published in September last year, and the many initiatives intended to encourage greater diversity, affordability and equitable housing options over the next decade. Small second dwellings are just one of the many elements to the plan, but one of the first to be delivered, and it is highly relevant to all of you within the building industry. Not only just in terms of practitioners, but also in terms of the trades, as we work towards delivering the ambitious housing agenda, which is actually there. Making it easier and more efficient to navigate approval pathways is just one of the many objectives that these reforms represent. As I'm sure you're all very familiar with, the planning and building systems are interlinked, but because they have very distinct purposes, it can be challenging to continue to ensure they work in harmony. Today, you will learn more about how reforms to the Victoria planning provisions and planning schemes to remove barriers to timely decision-making necessitated consequential building reforms to ensure that important siting and amenity standards are still met. Of particular interest in this case is the deregulation of planning requirements to enable this type of development to occur in more places across Victoria and increasing housing options to the community. To achieve this, the building framework needed to do more of the heavy lifting where the need for planning permits was removed. It's likely that the planning and building frameworks will continue to undergo similar changes that transform the traditional roles they have in setting standards and practices for land development and construction across the state. It's worth keeping that in mind as the presenters walk you through the origins of the reforms and how the policy objectives have informed the amendments to the Victorian planning provisions and building regulations that you now interact with on a daily basis. You all continue to play a pivotal role in supporting reforms and initiatives outlined in the landmark housing statement and the ongoing success of Victoria's construction industry. And I thank you all again for taking the time to tune in today. And on that note, a little bit about what to expect in today's session. We'll be talking about why we need more housing choice in Victoria, a high-level summary of the changes, a more detailed outline of the changes to the planning and building systems, some information about living in or renting out a small second dwelling, and then we'll spend some time answering any questions you may have. To present today, I'm joined by Michael Orford, who's the Manager of Statutory Reform at Department of Transport and Planning. He'll present on the changes to the planning system. Luke Hamlin, who's the Team Leader of Technical and Regulation of the Victorian Building Authority, who'll present on changes to the building system. And then my colleague Amanda Wellesley here at DTP will facilitate the Q&A session. Just some housekeeping before we get started. Feel free to ask any question using the Q&A function. You can see it in the command bar at the top of your screen. That's where we'll monitor the questions coming in and do our best to answer as many of them as we can in the time that we have. Today's session is being recorded and the video will be available on the VBA's YouTube channel in the coming days, so certainly keep an eye out for that. Thank you again for joining us all today, and I'll now hand over to Michael to present on the planning reforms for small second dwellings. Thanks, Michael.
Thanks very much, Andrew, and it's great to be with you all today. I know how much building surveyors all love planners, but I am going to take you through three main things today. So the first one is the policy settings for the small second dwelling reform. I'll then take you through a summary of the reform overall. And finally, I'll walk you through the changes to the planning system, which feed into the changes that have been made to the building regulations, which of course Luke will run through with you shortly. So first of all, why we need more housing choice. We all know that housing needs are changing, housing affordability is an issue, and that downsizing is becoming more popular, and smaller families are also more common. As Andrew mentioned, the former Premier announced that the government would make it easier to build a small second dwelling as part of the housing statement in September of last year. There are also some limitations to the previous process. So before, all small second dwellings were subject to the same planning provisions, regardless of size and impact. So a full planning scheme assessment applied, including potential VCAT appeals by neighbours. And this assessment wasn't proportional for small second homes. In addition, dependent persons unit requirements only applied in very specific circumstances. They were difficult to enforce and no siting requirements applied. If we could just go back a slide, Daniel, thank you. So now on to the new process. And this slide is a bit of a summary of the requirements for a small second dwelling. So importantly, a small second dwelling has its own discrete definition in both the planning and building systems. And we've also replicated the system that applies for single dwellings, that if no planning permit is required, the siting assessment is undertaken through the building system. If a planning permit is required and the siting matter is covered by the planning scheme assessment, the siting assessment happens through the planning system. So the key characteristics of a small second dwelling are that the floor area can't exceed 60 square metres. And this is to keep the size modest, but still be a livable 1 or 2 bedroom home, and it's consistent with the size in other jurisdictions. A small second dwelling must be sited on the same lot as an existing dwelling, so there must be a lawful main dwelling already there. Only one small second dwelling per lot, which again, this keeps the impact modest in residential zones and prevents the proliferation of them in rural areas. It must have a kitchen, a bathroom and a toilet, and car parking doesn't need to be provided unless the landowner wants to, though whatever's currently required for the main dwelling doesn't change. And that means that more people can build this type of housing more easily. Anyone can live in it or rent it out, and there are no restrictions like those that apply to a dependent persons unit. Subdivision from a primary dwelling or to create a new lot for a small second dwelling is prohibited. Connection to reticulated natural gas supply is also prohibited, in line with the government's announcement to transition away from gas last year. And finally, siting and amenity requirements apply, as does the minimum garden area, and I'll go into more details about those soon. So moving on to where they're permitted, all planning schemes have been amended, and the focus is on rural and residential zones, though other zones may also permit them. And then finally, permits are required. Planning won't usually require a planning permit, and I'll provide an overview of the planning permit requirements shortly. And building works will, of course, always need a permit. With the exception of basic siting and amenity requirements, these requirements and conditions can't be varied. Critically, as for single dwellings now, the siting and amenity assessment will be completed under the building system if no planning permit is required, and under the planning system if a planning permit is required and siting is required to be assessed through the planning scheme. Of course, if the requirements can't be met, it's always open to a landowner to apply for a planning permit for a dual occupancy as per the current process. Next slide, thanks Daniel. So Amendment VC 253 to the Victoria Planning Provisions and All Planning Schemes was gazetted and came into effect on the 14th of December last year, the same day as the changes to the building regulations. Now these are the key parts of the planning scheme that have changed. Firstly, a new land use term for small second dwelling has been created and dependent persons unit has been removed. The rural and residential zones contain the new land use term, and conditions on the use of land and subdivision restrictions are both in zones. Res Code, Clause 54, for one dwelling on a lot, has been updated to include requirements for and in relation to small second dwellings. Some overlays exempt a small second dwelling from the requirement to obtain a planning permit, and new Vic Smart classes have been added to apply to some applications. And changes to other provisions like development contributions, bushfire planning, and Clause 55 for 2 or more dwellings on a lot have also been amended. Transitional provisions for dependent persons units have been created, and consequential changes have also been made. As always, every change is detailed in the amendment documents for Amendment VC 253 on the planning.vic.gov.au website. Thanks, Daniel. Here's a quick visual of the land use terms under planning. Dependent persons unit has been deleted and small second dwelling has been added. Note that a small second dwelling is a completely separate land use from dwelling. Thanks, Daniel. So I'll now give you a quick overview of the planning permit requirements that apply, remembering, of course, that a building permit is always required. Now, the next few slides have quite a bit of information, so please bear with me. Firstly, you don't need a permit to use land in a residential zone for a small second dwelling if the following requirements are met. There must be no more than one dwelling existing on the lot. There must only be one small second dwelling on the lot. It must not be connected to reticulated gas. And any requirements in the low density residential zone and township zone for water, energy connections, and so on that already apply to single dwellings must be met. If you don't meet these requirements, the use of land for a small second dwelling is prohibited under the planning scheme. So let's move on to whether you need a planning permit for development. In a residential zone, other than a low density residential zone, you only need a planning permit if your lot is less than 300 square metres. And that application is likely to be a Vic Smart class of application because that's consistent with the approach that we already have for single dwellings. No planning permit is required for development of a small second dwelling in a low density residential zone. Thanks, Daniel. Now to the 6 rural zones. We've essentially split them into 2 groups based on the planning requirements for a single dwelling that already exist in each of the zones. So in a rural living zone, farming zone, or rural activity zone, no permit is required to use land if the following conditions are met. And these conditions are the same as the residential zones, which are there must be no more than one dwelling existing on the lot, there must only be one small second dwelling on the lot, and it must not be connected to reticulated gas. In addition, there are extra requirements for these zones to match those for single dwellings, which are about connections to services, including all-weather access, wastewater treatment, water and electricity. Setbacks related to the Mineral Resources Act and wind energy facilities also apply. If you don't meet those conditions, using land for a small second dwelling is prohibited. And there's no Section 2 planning permit required for any of these matters. In the other 3 zones, a green wedge zone, wedge A zone, and a rural conservation zone, you do need a permit to use land. And the conditions in those dot points that I ran through also apply. So what about development in the rural zones? Do you need a planning permit? Well, in the first of those 3 zones, you don't need a planning permit if the development is outside specified setbacks from sensitive uses and locations, including a road, a site boundary, another dwelling, another small second dwelling, a water body, or if earthworks aren't required. Otherwise, a planning permit is required, which is the same requirement that already exists in those zones for a dwelling. You always need a permit in the Green Wedge A, and Rural Conservation Zone to develop land. Next slide, thanks, Daniel. So now we come to overlays. And as you would know, overlays apply all sorts of different permit and other requirements to developments to manage specific issues. A small second dwelling is exempt from the requirement to obtain a planning permit in a heritage overlay, a design and development overlay, and a neighbourhood character overlay if the following development requirements are met. That is, that the building height of the small second dwelling does not exceed 5 metres, and it's finished in muted tones and colours. A planning permit is required if those requirements aren't met. Note that other requirements relating to the design or built form in the design and development overlay may also apply to a small second dwelling. Thanks, Daniel. So some changes to other overlays have also been made. In a significant landscape overlay, a permit is required to develop a small second dwelling, but the application will always be a VMIA class of application. For the airport-related overlays, currently they include extra requirements and conditions for dwellings and dependent persons units, and we've updated those to ensure that they apply to small second dwellings. In terms of other overlays, they continue to apply as normal. Thanks, Daniel. Now we come to the residential development provisions. Of course, they're known as Res Code. They sit in clauses 54 and 55 of the planning scheme, and these provisions ensure that the amenity of adjoining lots is protected and on-site matters are considered. So while changes have been made to all of these provisions, for now, I'm only going to talk about the changes to clause 54, because that's where the provisions that apply to small second dwellings are located in the planning scheme. Again, as per the current process for single dwellings, the requirements have been replicated in the building regulations. When a small second dwelling needs a planning permit and is constructed, the siting, design and amenity requirements that apply are set out in clause 54. Two new standards will apply just for small second dwellings. And for private open space requirements, they apply to both the existing dwelling and the new small second dwelling. The other thing to know is that adjoining an existing small second dwelling, clause 54 and clause 55 have been updated so that new developments on adjoining lots provide a reasonable standard of amenity to existing residents in an existing small second dwelling. Thanks, Daniel. So let's have a look now at what happens to movable homes, notably a dependent persons unit and a movable unit as defined under the Housing Act. So as I mentioned earlier, the land use term dependent persons unit has been removed from the planning scheme. However, there are still some protections for DPUs in the system. The amendment doesn't impact any lawfully constructed dependent persons units that were built before the changes were introduced. We've also introduced a new clause in the planning scheme, clause 5204. That applies in all planning schemes to provide transitional provisions for a dependent persons unit. These provisions allow a dependent persons unit to still be established within a specified period of time if a planning permit application is lodged or a building surveyor is either appointed or certifies that substantial progress has been made on the construction and development of the design of the dependent persons unit. We've also made changes to ensure development exemptions apply to movable units by or on behalf of Homes Victoria as well. Thanks, Daniel. So the introduction of small second dwellings also means some other changes to other parts of the planning scheme. And these changes include ensuring that planning provisions apply appropriately to small second dwellings where there are potential bushfire, flooding or other hazards, that no car parking requirements apply under clause 5206 of the planning scheme, and exempting a small second dwelling from needing to pay development contributions as well. Thanks, Daniel. We've also created a dedicated web page so that anyone looking to find out more about the reforms can start there. The web page has 3 guides in PDF form. There's a summary brochure pictured here with a very attractive 3D image, which of course will be useful for people looking for high-level information, or it might be something that you want to print out and have handy for any discussions with applicants. The Planning and Building Framework Guide, which takes you through the changes to the planning and building systems and how the reforms operate. And also there on your screen is an image of the applicant's guide, which sets out a checklist and the steps for getting started on an application for a small second dwelling. And it also includes a range of frequently asked questions and answers. So that's it from me and the planning scheme changes. And I'll pass over now to Luke to run you through the changes to the building system. Thanks, Luke.
Thank you very much, Michael. That was great. Okay, so yes, my name's Luke Hamblin. I'm the team leader of the technical and regulation team at the VBA, and I'm just going to run you through some of the changes to the building system for second small dwellings. So if we flick over, please. Regards to the building regulations, there's been some changes to Part 5 to include second small dwellings. That includes extending some of the regulations to include second small dwellings. And there's there's 3 new ones that are specifically designed for second small dwellings, and there's also a couple there. You can see 73 and 78, which do not apply to the second small dwellings. I'll go in a bit later into one of the new ones, which is Regulation 86, and how that permits an existing Class 1 to have a reduction in the private open space when you put in an SSD, and also just notifying you that Form 1 and 2 includes an option to select an SSD when you're filling out those forms. Next slide, please. Yeah, so the building definition, the definition of small second dwellings has been included in Part 5 of the building regulations, which is a Class 1A building with a gross floor area that is equal to or less than 60 square metres on the same allotment as an existing building that is a single dwelling. So it's been defined as its own Class 1A building, and it needs to ensure that suitable living arrangements for permanent residents are applicable in accordance with the National Construction Code. Thanks, Daniel. So some of the relevant siting requirements, as you can see here, we've got the table with 3 different columns. So in the first column here, we've got all the regulations, sort of the long-standing Part 5 regulations, which have been extended to include the SSDs. We've got Regulation 73 and 78, which are not applicable to SSDs. And then we have our 3 new regulations, which are 74A, 86A, and 86B. I know there's an error on that thing I've just noticed there. So that's actually Reg 86B. So yeah, those 3, they're newly instituted regulations, and they're specifically tailored to second small dwellings. There's also been amendments to existing regulations 76, 76A, 77, and 86, which are now inclusive of the lot upon which a small second dwelling is erected. Some key points just to think about with the Part 5 for SSDs. The new Regulation 74A, one of the new ones, is the building setback. So a small secondary dwelling must be positioned behind the primary dwelling's front wall, abutting the front street. Contrary to Regulation 74.3, which permits main dwellings to have certain encroachments, Regulation 74A2 prohibits features like gutters, porches, verandas, and decks exceeding 800 mm in height from extending past the primary dwelling's front wall. So basically, the SSD needs to be behind the primary dwelling. So that's one of the new regulations to keep in mind. Some of the other things to keep in mind is the site coverage regulation. So Regulation 76.5. So when you're constructing a second small dwelling, you need to still adhere to the site coverage regulations. They're still mandatory. So no more than 60% of the allotment can be occupied by buildings. Another thing to keep in mind, Regulation 76A. So the construction of a small second dwelling must comply with the minimum garden area requirement contingent to the allotment size. Regulation 77.4, permeability. So the allotment still must maintain that 20% permeable surface when you install that SSD. And another point of note, Regulation 79 for rear side and rear setbacks is the same for SSDs as it is for your standard original dwelling. So just on those aspects there, VBA to be releasing next week a new practice note that goes over the regulations for siting, and we're also in conjunction with that releasing a one that is specific to second small dwellings. So that will have a lot more detail on these regulations and how they apply to each. So that should be coming out in about a week. So stay tuned for that. Next slide, thank you. Another thing to keep in mind, so Regulation 19A allows for an owner to apply for a certificate of consent from that gives a couple of exemptions. So the 2 exemptions are when applying to the VBA to get an owner builder's certificate of consent. First exemption is that the owner does not need to reside in the dwelling. And the second exemption is that you still qualify even if you've had a owner's certificate of consent within the last 5 years. So with those two exemptions, essentially all owners wishing to build an SSD should be able to get that through the with consent from the VBA through our owner builder team. Thank you, Daniel. As we all know, Section 24 of the Act requires the relevant building surveyor to be satisfied that any planning permit has been obtained if it's required by the planning scheme. So When you're looking at these SSDs or potential SSDs, you need to make sure that they fall in line with that planning permit exemption. So as you can see, this is a snippet from the planning scheme. So if the gross floor area has to be under or under 60 square meters, it's got to have the kitchen, sink, food preparation, bath, shower, toilet, wash basin. So it needs to have all of those things to be exempt from that planning permit. Thank you. Yeah, now with the building permit process, it's going to be very similar to how an assessment is done just for a standard 1A, because I guess the SSD is its standalone 1A. So besides those slight variations in the Part 5 siting, everything else should be business as usual when you're assessing the SSD. So it's a separate Class 1A. All the provisions from the NCC Volume 2 apply. Sanitary facilities, it needs to have a laundry, livable housing provisions, energy efficiency, all of those things apply to the SSD. And you'll run through your normal process, you know, building permit, mandatory inspections, compliance certificates, and occupancy permit. So nothing will be different there. Just on that, I mentioned livable housing and energy efficiency. Just to plug, the VBA have a webinar on energy efficiency in 2 weeks, and then on the 28th of March, we have a livable housing webinar as well. So if you want to learn more about that, please stay tuned and come along to those as well. Thank you, Daniel. Now, fire separation. So an SSD is a separate Class 1A, as we've discussed. Therefore, it must be treated as any other building under the NCC. As you can see in these 2 pictures, the fire safety requirements would apply. So in the first example, each dwelling is separated by an external wall. In the second example, you can see that they have a separating wall with that fire rating there. So yes, they can be attached, but we need to have the appropriate fire separation as per normal in the NCC. Thank you. Next slide. Now, so this is another one of the new regulations specific to the private open space reduction. So Regulation 86A requires a second small dwelling to have a private open space of at least 8 metres squared with a minimum dimension of 1.6, which with convenient access from a habitable room that is not a bedroom. And Regulation 86.2B states that there is if there is a second small dwelling, the existing dwelling's private open space may be reduced to not less than 25 square metres. So as you can see there, you know, you're able to reduce the private open space requirement if you have an SSD. There's no requirement or restrictions to install fences or barriers between the existing Class 1 and the new SSD. However, you can put a fence in if you like, and then the requirements would be outlined in the you know, regulations relevant to a standard Class 1A. So for further information on fences, you can contact Consumer Affairs Victoria. But as I said, there's no requirement to fence off in between the SSD and the existing dwelling. Yeah, so just reiterating the floor area check. So the definition of gross floor area is taken from the Victoria Planning Scheme provisions, as Michael outlined earlier. Eaves and gutters can be excluded from the calculation, but any roofed area outside the external wall, such as like a roofed balcony, deck, pergola, that would form part of that gross area calculation. So you can see in that that image there that the roofed area covers the entire deck, so that would need to be included in the 60 square meters. If you had a roofed area only on half of that deck, then we would consider that only half of that deck would need to be included. So when you get those dicey ones like that, it's probably prudent if you're a building surveyor to get a property request from your local municipality, just to make sure that their interpretation is consistent with your own when you have those, you know, half roofed, you know, and you've got on the borderline of the 60 meters, just to be certain. So that's how I'd be handling that situation. Yeah, thank you. Next slide. Yeah, and siting regulations that aren't applicable. So the maximum street setback. So regulation only, so regulation 73 only applies to a Class 1 building when the first building is constructed. So the second small dwelling requires there to be a first building in place. So it's not really applicable. All you have to do, as per 74A, is make sure that SSD is behind the original dwelling. And car parking regulation states that car parking regulation does not apply to the construction of a second small dwelling. This means the additional parking is not required when considering SSD. So don't have to worry about parking, which is good. Next slide. Now, the third and final new regulation, 86B. So this is the requirement for a access path that needs to be clear and unobstructed from the frontage of the property. So it's basically a DDA path. As you can see, the requirements there, clear and unobstructed, is from the front street. If it was on a corner block, you would need to get a report and consent if you were going to the street that is not the front street. Regulation 86B doesn't provide clarity on when an object is considered an obstruction. So guidance is recommended that any object that would reasonably hinder walking is to be considered an obstruction, such as letterbox gates, fences, garage doors, carport, veranda posts, and retaining walls. I guess the intention of this regulation is to permit like a stretcher to get to the second small dwelling. So, you know, if any report and consents that come to council, you should probably keep that in mind. Like a pinch point of 400 might not be appropriate if you're trying to get a stretcher that's 600 wide down, for example. Also, Regulation 86B doesn't quite define what is considered as a seal or all-weather access path. So as a guidance, it's recommended that a path that not be affected by rain, such as concrete paving, like timber pavers, bricks, would be sufficient. And yeah, sort of like a sealed path, a rubber path would be considered, I guess, all-weather access. Or additionally, if the path was sheltered the entire way from the front by a carport, that would also, I believe, be considered all-weather access. And yeah, so an unobstructed path to the door is required and can be partially or fully satisfied by a driveway, so long as the requirements of Regulation 86B are met. Consideration should not be given to minimum dimensions of the access path if a car is parked in the driveway, along with the safety of the pedestrians in use. Okay, thank you. Next slide. Yeah, so in addition to the planning guidance Michael mentioned earlier, the Minister's Guideline MG12, siting and design for single dwellings, has been updated to include second small dwellings. Other than to vary compliance with the definition of small second dwelling, an application for report and consent may be required to the local relevant council in respect to the design of the SSD, in the same way as this pathway has always been available for single dwellings. For example, if a site constraint such as a slope configuration make it challenging to comply with the access requirements, you might consider designing a suitable alternative for consideration under a report and consent mechanism. Next slide. And yeah, that just about concludes my presentation. Just so you're aware, I've mentioned it earlier, but SIO1, which is a practice note, will be coming out this week, which will be an updated practice note on siting. We will also be, in conjunction with that, producing another practice note on SIO1, which is second small dwellings. And then we also, any questions that you have can also be directed to the Tech and Reg team on this to be addressed as well. So thank you very much for attending and getting involved. And I'll pass over to Amanda for the Q&A section.
Thanks, Luke, and thank you, Michael, both for your presentations today. Lots of detail there for everyone, and I can see some great questions coming in as well. I appreciate all of those questions coming through, so I might just start working through some of those in the time that we have left and hopefully get through as many as we possibly can. So the first one here, we've got from Rowan, if a small second dwelling meets the requirements to not require a planning permit, would the second dwelling require a building permit if it was an unregistered movable dwelling, effectively meaning that no planning permit or a building permit would be required? Is that a question potentially for you, Luke? No.
Yeah, that is a good question. Look, there are exemptions to the Building Act under the Residential Tenancy Act relevant for caravan parks. So look, it's one of those grey areas. You know, can it be removable within 24 hours? I guess that would be sort of outside of the SSD process and more of a you know, under that caravan park Act. So yeah, we'll have to take that one on notice to come up with a response there. But it's sort of yeah, falls sort of outside of a nice clean cut response, unfortunately.
No worries. Thanks for that information. We'll definitely take that one on notice. Thank you, Rowan. A couple of questions in the chat just around laundry facilities. So appreciate, I think some of these came in before we managed to detail some of that in the presentations, but probably worth just covering off the NCC requirements there for small second dwellings. Maybe Luke, do you just want to recap some of the advice there?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's basically the same considerations you would have for a normal Class 1A. So it's effectively the same. There's no concessions or requirement not to have one. It needs to be self-contained 1A.
Thanks, Luke. Okay, we've got a question, I think, for you, Michael, just related to dependent persons units. So if the dependent persons units have now been removed from the planning scheme as, or the planning provisions rather, does that mean that they're no longer able to be constructed?
Thanks, Amanda. So obviously I outlined that there are some transitional provisions that apply to dependent persons units, and they're set out in clause 5204 of the planning scheme. So certainly check to see if any proposals that you have in train are able to take benefit from those transitional provisions. At the conclusion of the transitional provision period, that's correct, yes, dependent persons units will no longer be able to be constructed. We are aware of submissions in relation to dependent persons units, including some commentary and articles related to them, and that matter is under active consideration by the government as we speak.
Thanks, Michael. I can see a few hands up. I'm just going to ask if you can please to pop the question in the chat just so that we don't lose that. We've got quite a lot of people in the room, want to try and get to as many as we can. So if you can type it into the Q&A function in the command bar at the top there, that'll make sure that we just capture it. Also, if we, for whatever reason, we don't get through all of them today, we can definitely follow up after today's session. So next question, I think, is also potentially for you, Michael, just related to movable units. I think you did cover this a little bit in your presentation, but again, just an opportunity to recap. Is a building permit required for movable? Oh, actually, now that I've said building permit, it's probably a question for Luke, but feel free to both of you to jump in. Is a building permit required for movable 1 or 2 bedroom units offered by the Department of Housing and movable rooms offered for lease by companies such as Room to Move?
It's a great question. I'm happy to start with the planning requirements if you like. There is an exemption in clause 62 of the planning scheme that provides an exemption for movable units by on behalf of Homes Victoria. So depending on the nature of the particular movable unit and whether it would meet that exemption, there is the provision there for them to not require a planning permit.
Yeah, and I guess from the VBA's perspective, if it is if you are going for a doing building work, then you will require a building permit. So if you want it to be like in a permanent structure, then you would require the SSD requirements to be completed.
I'll probably chime in there with a little bit to add to that one, only because I'm familiar with the policy from having worked on these reforms. But certainly, when you're talking about a movable unit that is within the definition of the Housing Act, there are some exemptions under the building regulations related to building permits. So worth checking those out, though, depending on your very specific circumstances, to make sure that you have covered off any requirements for building permits or compliance elements there, because there are some conditions related to that if you do meet those definitions. Onto a question from Sally. What about corner blocks where the SSD would have a street frontage? And I think this one came in around the time we were talking about that requirement for SSDs not to be situated any further forward on the allotment than the front wall of the existing dwelling. Maybe that's a question possibly for you, Michael. Are you able to provide any clarity on that one?
Certainly, I'll do my best to translate from planning to building in my head. But yes, there's regulation 74 that continues to apply to a small second dwelling. So the usual street setback requirements, including for corner lots, continue to apply to a small second dwelling. and that must be met in addition to the requirement for them to be set back behind the front wall of the dwelling. So both regulations must be met, effectively ensuring that the street setback requirement is met via Regulation 74, and then under the new regulation, it must be therefore also set back behind the front wall of the dwelling. So both requirements must be met.
I think just to add to that, I think there might be some situations on a corner block where practically, it might be best to have the path coming from the corner block, but that would have to be, you'd have to get a report and consent from the local council to obtain that way. So that's probably the best pathway to achieve that if it's suitable for the corner block.
Thank you both. On to the next question from Ross. This is related to stormwater requirements. So will the new second dwelling need to meet storm requirements for discharge of additional impermeable area from the site? Maybe I'll throw to you on that one, Michael.
Thanks, Amanda, and good question, Ross. So in terms of planning, depending on the local council and whether they have a local policy in relation to water-sensitive urban design, there may be requirements that do apply. So some councils do require the submission of a storm report, as you've indicated, for all new buildings under some policies. So it does depend on the council as to whether they have that policy included in their planning scheme, and also whether a planning permit is required as to whether the storm report needs to be submitted with the planning permit application.
Excellent. Thanks, Michael. Quick question from Frank. Will the video file be available afterwards? Yes, it absolutely will. We're planning on publishing the recording today. So if you missed any part of it or you want to review any of the information, it will be available after today's session. A question from Kath. Should the calculation of the floor area, such as including roofed deck or verandas, be defined or specified in the VBA practice note so that there is no potential for interpretation issues between municipalities? Appreciate that hasn't yet been published, Luke, but is there any further clarity you can provide on that question?
Yeah, so we obviously don't make the legislation at the VBA. We sort of in the Tech and Reg team we try and clarify. So we can give examples on what we think is the best, but we don't we sort of don't have authority over local municipalities and their planning areas. So we will we will address it as best as we can in our practice note, and it has been. I have seen the draft, and it is there is an example there. But when you do have, like I said in the thing, when you do have those semi-roofed balconies, it's probably best to go to your municipality and get that clarification from them to make sure that you're right. But look, because we can provide what we believe, but it might be looked at differently by the local municipalities planning.
Thanks, Luke. Question from Mason. I think this one's for you, Michael, just related to future alterations and additions to small second dwellings. So if a small second dwelling is built at 60 square metres without a planning permit required, and then later down the track, a Class 10A veranda and deck were built as an extension to the small second dwelling, would that require a planning permit, as you would therefore exceed the minimum, the gross floor area requirements of the SSD?
What a great question, Mason. So in terms of small second dwellings, they must continue to meet that requirement for 60 square metres. So if they are any larger than 60 square metres, it becomes prohibited under the planning scheme. So it's not possible for you to extend it later, make it bigger than 60 square metres down the track without a change of use required. So for example, you might be able to submit a Clause 55 application for 2 dwellings on a lot and extend it that way. Making sure that you comply with the relevant requirements of Clause 55. But as soon as it's over 60 square metres, it's no longer a small second dwelling, and it needs to go through a separate process for assessment under Clause 55.
Thanks, Michael. Possibly a question for you, Luke. So we've got a question from Matt. Are steps allowed in the path? Are there exemptions for sloping sites? Assume that relates to the accessibility requirements for the small second dwellings.
Yes, that's a good question, actually. I actually don't know. I'll have to get back to you on that one. We'll clarify that in our practice note. Yeah, regarding the accessibility, I don't believe it is sort of specifically outlined, but I guess it would be similar to steps up to your property. But yeah, look, I'll have to get back to you. Sorry.
Michael, you might also have some thoughts here, but I would imagine that steps are probably not something that we'd be looking for in the accessibility path, and also need to probably consider the introduction of livable housing standards in the next iteration of the NCC. But any clarification there in terms of planning requirements for that access path?
Yeah, a really good question, and certainly agree with you, Amanda, in terms of the livable housing requirements. In terms of the policy position, I think it sets out in the regulations and in the planning scheme that there is a maximum grade for the pedestrian path. So do keep that in mind when you've got a proposal before you. If it does exceed the grade that's specified in the regulation, then obviously a report and consent would be required.
Excellent. A question here, is the small second dwelling subject to single dwelling covenant restrictions? One for you, Michael.
Yes, a favourite question here. So a restrictive covenant is a private treaty or written agreement between landowners, and essentially they can limit the way that land is used and developed. Each one is different, and state and local governments don't create them, they don't enforce them. It's usually done by the landowners who benefit from the covenant, often through the Supreme Court. So each covenant needs to be looked at individually. And if you've got an applicant that has a covenant, it's probably best to seek some independent legal advice from a solicitor or a property law professional that's experienced in those matters.
Thanks, Michael. We've got a question here just related to, I suppose, services and the separate addressing of small second dwellings. I'm not sure whether you'll be able to answer this one specifically, but maybe potentially some guidance on where to go. So any research been done on how to get separate NBN service where there is no separate address, or things like mail delivery and the like? How could that be managed?
Yeah, I can jump in that one. So, with the services such as NBN rates, street number, bin collection, so that's sort of outside of the building regulations. So you need to refer to like the respective agencies. So that's the VBA's position on that. It's sort of like individually how it's done. If it's like in terms of billing, who pays for the billing, that's sort of under the Tenancy Act with the between the owner to make the decision on.
Excellent. Thanks, Luke.
I can add something there too, Amanda, if of assistance. So for planning, when a subdivision is undertaken, it does require the separate provision of internet services and telecommunications. So that's the threshold for when those services are required to be provided. So if it's a small second dwelling in a backyard, it's up to the owner of the property to ensure that, if there's services that are required to be provided to the small second dwelling, that they're shared with the main house. So it's not a separate requirement to provide a separate connection to the small second dwelling for telecommunications.
Thanks, Michael. Next question related to the private open space. So what if we combine the secluded private open space with the existing dwelling and SSD? Do we need to combine the 25 square metres and 8 square metres?
Yeah, so they must be distinct, separate recreational private open space areas.
Yeah, so must be separated. Yeah, and that's the minimum requirement. You'll probably notice that is a change from the normal, as you outlined earlier, Luke, that's a change from what would be required for a single dwelling on an allotment there, and that's designed to provide that clarity on the minimum requirements for each of the existing dwelling and the small second dwelling.
Yeah, one point of note on that too, unroofed decks and alike, verandas, pergolas attached also form part of that private open space as well. So that can form your part of your calculation there as well.
Next question, a bit of a simple one, but one for you, Michael. Can you build a small second dwelling over 60 square metres with a planning permit?
No is the short answer. The long answer is that if you did wish to build a dwelling over 60 square metres with an existing dwelling already on the lot, that you can undertake a Clause 55 application through Res Code and progress an application for a planning permit for 2 dwellings on a lot. So yes, it's possible, but it's no longer a small second dwelling.
Thank you. And would it be possible to get a consent to build a small second dwelling in front of an existing dwelling? Possibly one for you there, Luke.
No, that would not be, as per the new regulation, you need a report and consent for that. So that doesn't fit neatly into the exemption. You need to be behind the existing dwelling.
No worries, thank you. Can a habitable detached bungalow, which is ancillary to the existing Class 1A dwelling on the site, still be built? I'm assuming that the rest of that question is related to, can it be built as a small second dwelling if it is not fully self-contained? This is a common question we get, actually. So maybe I might start with you, Michael, just to explain it from the planning perspective, and then I'll hand over to Luke to cover over the building requirements.
Sure, thanks, Amanda. So under the planning scheme, a small second dwelling must have those 4 attributes that we ran through. So it must be fully self-contained with the kitchen, the bathroom, etc. And if it doesn't meet those requirements, it's not a small second dwelling as far as planning is concerned. So it's something else. What is it? We're looking at it at the moment as part of a dwelling. That's how we consider it. And I understand that that's the same through building, but happy to pass to Luke to explain in relation to that.
Yeah, no, nothing to add from me. I'm in line with Michael on that response.
Excellent, thank you both. Just working through a few of the more recent questions. Just another one here, I think, on movable dwelling. So Schedule 3, Item 18 of the Building Regulations 2018 covers relocatable buildings. That is a movable unit within the meaning of the Housing Act. So I think that's thank you to Kath there, just clarifying the comments that we made earlier in terms of those movable units and the requirements there. So you'll find the details in Schedule 3, Item 18 of the Building Regulations. Another good question from Roger that we have received a couple of times in the past. So could a small second dwelling be elevated over a parking space or garage? We get similar questions in terms of could it be constructed, for example, over a garage out the rear of an allotment? So Michael, I might throw to you first and then and give Luke a chance to cover off the building requirements after that.
Sure. The short answer is yes, it can be constructed attached to a dwelling, within a dwelling, above a garage, out the back, detached. There's many options, and it's a very flexible product. So yes, the short answer to that question from Roger is yes.
Yeah, and same from us, just all normal requirements comply, but yeah, that could be achieved.
Excellent. Thank you both. Just a question here about, I suppose, the interaction between Class 1A buildings and SSDs on the allotment, where you've got, so given that a Class 1A building can be more than one building under the regs, what would stop roof decks associated with the first dwelling from being used by the SSD and having that shared, I suppose, deck space, but which would also potentially push it over that requirement, that 60 metres squared requirement? I imagine that that potentially, from a planning perspective, Michael probably then would trigger a planning permit, but I'll hand that one over to you.
Yes, indeed. So, of course, if anything associated with the SSD is over that 60 square metres in floor area, it's no longer an SSD. If you do have that situation, I would assume that you'd need to make sure that that area for the roof is either clearly provided with access to the main dwelling so that it forms part of that, and then the SSD can continue to comply with the 60 square metre floor area requirement.
Just on a building perspective, I think the only issue that you may arise is the fire separation if you've got a deck connecting both as well. So that's another consideration that needs to be undertaken there.
Yeah, good points. Thank you both. Another question just related to laundry requirements. Again, this is something that does come up a fair bit. So as the planning permit exemption does not include a laundry, can you explain how an RBS should assess an SSD with a laundry under NCC BCA deemed to satisfy provisions? Yeah, I might hand over to you there, Luke, on that one.
Yeah, it would just be the same as a normal Class 1A. There's no difference to how that's assessed. So you need to provide the wash basin and the sanitary facilities. I have to pull up the exact code there, but yeah, it's as per a normal Class 1A.
Yep. It's probably important to note the distinction there. Obviously, planning needs to provide a definition for the purposes of the Victoria planning provisions, and then the regulations themselves take their cue from the planning provisions in terms of that definition. But having the definition of a Class 1A under the Part 5 of the building regulations then gives effect to the NCC and all requirements there. So even though the planning scheme or the planning provisions rather don't specify a laundry, the definition of of the small second dwelling as a 1A then triggers the need for all of those sanitary facilities and other health and amenity facilities under the NCC, and that's how it's captured. So yeah, definitely taking cues from that definition there in terms of understanding what's applicable in these situations. Okay, and then another question just attached to that one is, if the owner opts not to install a laundry, then I assume it is treated like a habitable bungalow or detached addition to the Class 1A. That's a really great question. One for you potentially, Luke.
Yeah, that's right. It wouldn't be required. Yeah, if it doesn't have a laundry, then it won't be an SSD. So
Yep.
yeah.
So considered a detached part of the existing Class 1A, but wouldn't meet that definition of self-contained, and therefore would not meet the definition of a small second dwelling. Another question here related to car parking. So understanding that an SSD does not require to accommodate car parking facilities. However, if a garage or car park could be accommodated and was a preferred amenity as part of the SSD, how is a garage assessed? Maybe one for you there, Michael, to start with.
Yes, certainly. So in terms of the floor area, it must obviously continue to comply with the 60 square metres if the owner did elect to choose to use some of that floor area and allocate it to a garage or car parking facilities. Otherwise, garages and carports, etc., would probably form part of outbuildings under the definition of a dwelling in the planning scheme. So they don't necessarily need to be associated with the small second dwelling and form part of the floor area if they can form part of the primary dwelling that's on the lot. So that's how planning would look at that one.
Excellent, thank you. Getting to the end of the questions here, and also just noting the time, we'll try and get through as many as we can in the last 4 minutes that we have with you all. Understanding that an SSD does not, I've already asked that one. My apologies. Will an SSD require a civil engineering design for the stormwater? Potentially a question for you there, Luke.
Yes, I guess it would just be as per normal class ones. It would depend on the RBS if they're asking for it, but it would just need to have the appropriate plumbing compliance certificates as per your normal class 1. So yeah, that would be sort of in terms of what your actual RBS would accept.
Excellent one to think about in terms of the specific site conditions there, I imagine. So can an existing dwelling, if 60 square metres or less, fall under the Act? I assume the question there is, could an existing dwelling be considered a small second dwelling if it met the requirements of such? Probably relatively straightforward question, but I might hand to you there, Luke.
So what's the purpose of the question? I'm just a bit unsure about why that would be sort of, it's an existing building there. Would it? Yeah, I'm just a bit unsure. Can you repeat that one?
Yeah, so can an existing dwelling, if 60 square metres or less, fall under the Act? I assume that means would it comply with would it effectively meet the definition of a small second dwelling? My guess is yes, it would.
Yeah, I guess it would. If there's already one sort of existing dwelling, another Class 1A, then it would, yes, technically fall under the second small dwelling provision. Yeah.
Excellent. So a quick question from Michael. Are the updated building regulation documents available for download online? Yes, they are, Michael. And I think also you'd be able to find links to that under the legislation page on the Victorian Building Authority's website. Is that right, Luke?
Yes, that's correct. Yep.
Yep, excellent. And just noting the time, I might cover off just one last question. I think we've already covered this one, but can we have multiple SSDs on an allotment? One for you, Michael.
The short answer is no, only one per allotment. And Amanda, I do know there's another question there about if you can build it in a garage if the building exceeds 5 metres. The 5 metre requirement applies in the heritage overlay. So just to note that the usual height requirements in the residential zones continue to apply to small second dwellings. So 9 metres NRZ, 11 metres GRZ, or whatever specified in the schedule.
Excellent. Thank you for that. And thank you for squeezing one extra question into the session. So appreciate that there are a few hands up and that there may be a few extra questions that you have. I'm not sure if we can quickly flick up the slide with a bit more information, but suggestions there would be to definitely head to the Department of Transport and Planning's website and find the information on SSDs that Michael discussed a little bit earlier, and look for those guides related to the planning policy. And as you can see on the screen there, checking out the VBA's website for more information to see those FAQs and to direct you to where to download extra information. And yeah, if you have any other questions, sending them on through to the VBA's Tech and Reg inquiry line there. Thank you so much for all of your questions today, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us. It's been really great to have so many people in the room and to receive those questions. It always helps to understand where we might need to provide a bit more guidance to industry and certainly how these reforms have landed. So we've really enjoyed being able to bring this information to you today, and we really appreciate your attendance and your questions. Thank you all very much, and enjoy the rest of your Thursday.